The smoke detector's piercing shriek echoed through the suburban Denver home at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, jolting the entire Rodriguez family from their beds. As they stumbled downstairs in their pajamas, they found 23-year-old Coleen White standing in their kitchen, covered head to toe in flour, surrounded by what appeared to be the remnants of an exploded gingerbread house factory. The oven was smoking, the stovetop was somehow flooded with green frosting, and their cat, Mr. Whiskers, was hanging upside down from the chandelier, apparently having launched himself there to escape the chaos below. Coleen Marie White, her Aunt Patricia Rodriguez called out, using that tone that made grown men tremble. "What in the name of all that's holy happened in my kitchen?" That was the night everything changed. That was the night that led to the ban. And that was the night that would eventually prove that sometimes the biggest disasters lead to the most beautiful transformations.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, in September, Coleen White sat in her cramped studio apartment in Capitol Hill, staring at her laptop screen displaying yet another rejection email. The Denver Museum of Nature and Science had decided to go with someone else for their educational program coordinator position. It was the 14th rejection in 6 weeks, and each one felt like another nail in the coffin of her post-college dreams. At 23, Coleen found herself in that peculiar purgatory that many recent graduates know well. Too qualified for entry-level retail jobs, not experienced enough for the career positions she actually wanted. Her environmental science degree from Colorado State University hung on the wall like an expensive piece of decorative paper, mocking her daily as she scrolled through job listings and ate ramen noodles for the 3rd time that week. The worst part wasn't the job hunt itself. It was watching her college friends seemingly glide into their perfect careers while she remained stuck. Her roommate from freshman year, Jessica Chen, was already working at a prestigious environmental consulting firm in California. Her study partner, Marcus Thompson, had landed a research position with the National Park Service. Even her lab partner, the chronically late and perpetually disorganized Tyler Williams, had somehow secured a job with a renewable energy company in Austin. Meanwhile, Coleen was surviving on her meager savings and the occasional freelance tutoring gig that barely covered her rent, student loan payments, and groceries. She'd moved to Denver after graduation, drawn by the city's reputation for environmental innovation and outdoor lifestyle, but instead of hiking 14ers and building a meaningful career, she found herself trapped in a cycle of applications, rejections, and increasingly desperate browsing of job boards. Her family situation didn't help matters. Coleen had been raised primarily by her grandmother, Eleanor White, after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. Grandma Eleanor had been a force of nature, a retired school principal who could command a room with a single look and could make a 5-course meal appear seemingly out of thin air. She'd taught Coleen everything from proper table manners to basic life skills. But there was one glaring exception: cooking. Every time young Coleen had tried to help in the kitchen, something had gone catastrophically wrong. At age 10, she'd somehow managed to create what Grandma Eleanor called concrete scrambled eggs, a gray, rubbery mass that required a chisel to remove from the pan. At 12, her attempt at chocolate chip cookies resulted in what could only be described as charcoal discs that set off every smoke alarm in the house. By 14, she'd been permanently banned from anything more complicated than making sandwiches and heating up leftovers. "Some people are born to cook, honey," Grandma Eleanor would say kindly, but firmly. "And some people are born to order takeout. There's no shame in knowing which one you are." When Eleanor passed away 2 years ago, during Coleen's junior year in college, she'd left behind a house full of memories, a collection of handwritten recipes that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the good they did Coleen, and a deep sense of loss that went beyond grief. Coleen felt disconnected from a fundamental part of her family heritage, the ability to create comfort and joy through food. Now, living alone in Denver and struggling to make ends meet, this disconnect felt more acute than ever. She watched cooking shows with a mixture of fascination and despair, like someone studying a foreign language they were convinced they'd never master. She'd tried following simple recipes from YouTube tutorials, but somehow her attempts always deviated wildly from the expected outcomes. A basic pasta sauce became a sticky, bitter mess. Banana bread turned into something that could probably be used as a doorstop. The financial strain was becoming unbearable. Takeout and prepackaged meals were eating up a significant portion of her already tight budget, but every attempt at home cooking ended in waste and frustration. She'd calculated that learning to cook properly could save her nearly $300 a month, money she desperately needed for student loans and basic living expenses.
Her social life had also taken a hit. While her peers were hosting dinner parties and potluck gatherings, Coleen felt embarrassed to contribute anything homemade. She'd become the friend who always brought store-bought items or volunteered to handle cleanup instead of cooking. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it reinforced her growing sense of being somehow deficient as an adult. The isolation was compounded by her living situation. Her studio apartment had a kitchenette that was barely functional, a 2-burner electric cooktop, a mini fridge, and an oven that seemed to have only 2 settings: Arctic freeze and surface of the sun. She'd convinced herself that her cooking failures were partly due to inadequate equipment, but deep down she suspected the problem was more fundamental. Her aunt Patricia Rodriguez, Grandma Eleanor's younger sister, had been trying to convince Coleen to move in with her family for months. Patricia lived in Lakewood with her husband Miguel and their twin 15-year-old sons, Carlos and Diego. They had a big house with a proper kitchen and plenty of space, and Patricia worried constantly about Coleen struggling alone. "Mija, you don't have to do this by yourself," Patricia would say during their weekly phone calls. "Family is supposed to help family. Your grandmother would want you to be somewhere safe and comfortable while you get on your feet." But Coleen's pride kept getting in the way. She'd worked so hard to establish her independence, to prove she could make it on her own as an adult. Moving back in with family, even temporarily, felt like admitting defeat. Besides, she'd heard the stories about Patricia's legendary holiday cooking, elaborate spreads that took days to prepare, and brought extended family from across Colorado to gather around the table. The thought of being in that kitchen, surrounded by such culinary expertise, while being unable to contribute anything meaningful, filled her with anxiety. Patricia Rodriguez was indeed a formidable cook. She'd learned from the same grandmother who'd raised Coleen, but somehow Patricia had inherited all the culinary genes that had skipped her niece. Patricia's Christmas tamales were spoken of in reverent whispers among the extended family. Her Thanksgiving turkey was so perfectly prepared that Miguel's co-workers begged him annually to bring leftovers. Her Sunday dinners were neighborhood legends, with the aroma of her slow-cooked carnitas drawing neighbors to find excuses to stop by around mealtime. The kitchen was Patricia's domain, and she ruled it with loving but absolute authority. Miguel and the boys knew better to interfere when she was in full cooking mode, understanding intuitively that their role was to stay out of the way and express appropriate appreciation when called to the table. It was a well-orchestrated family dynamic that had worked beautifully for nearly 20 years. As October arrived and Coleen's savings dwindled to dangerously low levels, she found herself facing an increasingly stark choice. She could swallow her pride and accept her aunt's offer of help, or she could continue struggling alone in her overpriced studio apartment, living on pasta and anxiety, while her job search continued to yield nothing but form rejection letters. The decision was ultimately made for her when her landlord announced a rent increase that would take effect in December. The additional $200 monthly was simply impossible on her current income. With a heavy heart and wounded pride, Coleen called her Aunt Patricia and accepted the offer to move in with the Rodriguez family. "Oh, Mija, this is wonderful," Patricia had exclaimed, her joy so genuine that it made Coleen feel guilty for waiting so long. "We'll have such a good time together, and just in time for the holidays. You can help me with all the Christmas preparations."
It was that last comment that sent a chill down Coleen's spine. Help with Christmas preparations meant cooking, and cooking meant the inevitable humiliation of revealing just how completely incompetent she was in the kitchen. She tried to imagine herself attempting to help Patricia with her renowned Christmas feast and could only envision disaster. But what choice did she have? As she began packing her meager belongings in early November, Coleen told herself that maybe this was an opportunity to finally learn from someone who actually knew what they were doing. Maybe, under Patricia's guidance, she could finally overcome whatever mental block had kept her from mastering even the most basic culinary skills. She had no idea that her first real attempt at serious cooking would result in a kitchen that looked like a war zone, a smoke alarm that brought 3 fire trucks to the Rodriguez house, and a family ban that would change the trajectory of her entire life.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Moving into the Rodriguez household was like stepping into a different world entirely. The sprawling 2-story home in Lakewood sat on a corner lot with mature oak trees and a front porch that wrapped around the side of the house. Inside, the walls were covered with family photos spanning 3 generations, children's artwork that had somehow survived into the teenage years, and the warm patina that comes from decades of love and laughter. The kitchen was Patricia's crown jewel, a spacious room with granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and enough cabinet space to stock a small restaurant. Copper pots hung from a wrought iron rack above a center island that doubled as a homework station for Carlos and Diego. The pantry was organized with military precision, every spice labeled and every ingredient in its designated place. "This is where the magic happens," Patricia had said proudly during Coleen's first tour, running her hand along the marble countertop like a pianist caressing piano keys. 47 Thanksgivings, 23 Christmas Eves, countless Sunday dinners, and more birthday cakes than I can count. This kitchen has fed half the neighborhood over the years. Coleen nodded appreciatively while internally cataloging all the ways she could potentially destroy this culinary sanctuary. The 6-burner gas range alone seemed capable of producing enough flames to level the entire house if mishandled. She made a mental note to stick to her usual strategy of staying as far away from cooking operations as possible. The first few weeks passed smoothly enough. Coleen settled into the converted den that served as her temporary bedroom, complete with its own entrance so she could maintain some independence. She continued her job search with renewed determination, now that she wasn't spending half her mental energy worrying about rent money. Patricia's morning coffee and Miguel's gentle jokes about the Denver Broncos created a routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. Carlos and Diego, the 15-year-old twins, were initially skeptical of their temporary house guest. They'd grown accustomed to having their parents' attention and weren't thrilled about sharing space with their older cousin. But Coleen won them over by helping with homework assignments and not ratting them out when she caught them sneaking back into the house past curfew one Friday night. "You're not as lame as we thought you'd be," Carlos admitted one evening while Coleen helped him with a chemistry lab report. Coming from a teenager, this qualified as high praise. "Thanks, I think," Coleen replied, laughing. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me all month." Diego looked up from his history textbook. "Mom says you're really smart but can't cook anything without burning it down. Is that true?" "Unfortunately, yes. Your mom is being generous when she says I can't cook. The truth is, I'm a legitimate fire hazard in any kitchen. That's actually kind of cool, like having a superpower, but a really useless one." The easy camaraderie with the twins was a bright spot in what had otherwise been a challenging period. But as November progressed and Coleen's job search continued to yield nothing but polite rejections, she began to feel increasingly like a burden on the family.
She tried to contribute by handling household chores, running errands, and helping the boys with homework, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was taking more than she was giving. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday afternoon in late November. Coleen had just received her third rejection of the week, this time from a position she'd been genuinely excited about with a local environmental nonprofit. She was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at her laptop screen and fighting back tears of frustration when Patricia came home from her job as a school administrator. "Another rejection?" Patricia asked gently, setting down her purse and moving instinctively toward the coffee maker. "Colorado Environmental Alliance. They said I was an impressive candidate, but they decided to go with someone with more experience." Coleen's voice cracked slightly on the last word. "How am I supposed to get experience if no one will give me a chance to get experience?" Patricia poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her niece. "Mija, I know this is frustrating, but—" "Aunt Patricia, I can't keep living here like this," Coleen interrupted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You and Uncle Miguel have been incredible, but I feel like a freeloader. I eat your food, use your electricity, take up space in your house, and I can't even contribute to basic household tasks because I'm apparently too incompetent to operate a kitchen without professional supervision." "That's ridiculous, Coleen. You're family. You help with the boys, you keep the house organized, I warm up leftovers and make sandwiches. That's not helping. That's just existing here while you do all the real work." Patricia studied her niece's face, recognizing the particular brand of stubborn pride that had been passed down through 3 generations of strong-willed women in their family. She'd seen the same expression on Eleanor's face and on her own mother's face, and sometimes in her own mirror when she was determined to handle everything herself. "What if you could contribute more?" Patricia asked carefully. "What do you mean?"
Christmas is in 4 weeks. Every year, I spend the entire month of December cooking and preparing for our Christmas Eve celebration. This year, we're expecting 37 people. Family from New Mexico, Miguel's coworkers, the neighbors who've become like family. She paused, looking suddenly tired. It's a lot for one person to handle. Coleen felt her stomach drop. "Aunt Patricia, if you're suggesting that I help with the cooking, I need to remind you that I once managed to burn water. Literally. I was trying to boil water for tea and somehow scorched the bottom of the pot so badly that we had to throw it away." "I know about your cooking history, Mija, but maybe that's because no one ever really taught you properly. Your grandmother, bless her heart, was an amazing cook, but she wasn't patient with teaching. She was more of a get out of my way and let me do it right kind of person." This was true. Grandmother Eleanor had been loving, but exacting, and her approach to cooking disasters had been to prevent them by simply not allowing Coleen near anything more complicated than a toaster. "I've been thinking," Patricia continued, "that maybe you've never had a real chance to learn because everyone's been too worried about potential disasters to let you actually practice. What if we started small? What if, instead of trying to stay out of my way, you actually worked with me to prepare for Christmas?" "Patricia, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but hear me out. What if this could be your contribution to the family? What if instead of feeling like you're taking up space, you could actually be an essential part of making this Christmas happen?" Coleen stared at her aunt, torn between hope and terror. The idea of finally being useful, of actually contributing something meaningful to the family, was incredibly appealing. But the specter of her past cooking disasters loomed large. "What if I ruin everything? What if I destroy Christmas dinner for 37 people?" "What if you don't?" Patricia countered. "What if, with proper instruction and enough practice, you could actually learn to cook? What if the only thing standing between you and basic culinary competence is experience and confidence?" "The last time I tried to help with a family meal, I gave half the people at my college roommate's birthday party food poisoning from undercooked chicken. They called it the Great Salmonella Incident of 2023. Patricia winced slightly, but didn't back down. "Okay, so we'll start with dishes that don't involve chicken. Look, Coleen, I've been cooking for this family for 20 years. I know every trick, every shortcut, every way to fix mistakes before they become disasters. What if you had someone who could actually guide you through the process instead of just hoping for the best? The offer was tempting beyond belief. Coleen had always felt excluded from the family tradition of elaborate holiday meals. She'd watched from the sidelines as aunts and female cousins gathered in kitchens, sharing recipes and stories, bonding over the ancient ritual of feeding their families. She'd always imagined what it would feel like to be part of that tradition instead of just a grateful recipient. "You really think I could learn?" she asked quietly. "I think you're one of the smartest people I know, and I think the only reason you can't cook is because no one's ever really taught you properly. Cooking isn't magic, mija. It's just chemistry and timing and practice." "And what if I prove that some people really are just hopeless in the kitchen?" Patricia smiled. "Then we'll order pizza for 37 people and tell everyone it's a new family tradition. But I don't think that's going to happen." That evening, after Miguel and the boys had gone to bed, Patricia pulled out a worn recipe box that Coleen recognized from Grandmother Eleanor's kitchen. It was filled with index cards covered in careful handwriting, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and scraps of paper with notes scrawled in margins. "These were your grandmother's recipes," Patricia said, settling beside Coleen at the kitchen table. "She gave them to me when she got sick, said she wanted them to stay in the family. I always hoped someday you'd want to learn them." Coleen picked up a card marked, "Eleanor's Famous Tamales, Christmas 1987. The writing was faded, but still legible, with notes like, "Add more cumin if Miguel is coming," and "Double batch if the Gonzalez family is invited." She wrote notes about people? She cooked for people, not just recipes. She knew Uncle Roberto liked extra spice, that Cousin Maria couldn't eat too much garlic, that your grandfather would sneak extra dessert if she wasn't watching. Food was how she showed love. As they sat there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the tools and ingredients that had fed their family for generations, Coleen felt something shift inside her. Maybe this wasn't about becoming a master chef or proving her worth to the family. Maybe this was about connecting with something larger than herself, about carrying forward a tradition that had been temporarily interrupted but never truly lost. "Okay, let's do this. Let's see if I can actually learn to cook." Patricia's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Really? You're sure?" "I'm terrified, but yes, if you're willing to risk your Christmas dinner on my potential competence, then I'm willing to try not to burn your house down in the process." "Oh, mija, this is going to be wonderful. We'll start this weekend with something simple, maybe cookies or a basic bread, and then we'll work our way up to the more complicated dishes." As Coleen looked around the kitchen that had seemed so intimidating just a few hours ago, she felt the first stirring of something that might have been excitement. For the first time in months, she had a goal that felt meaningful and achievable. She was going to learn to cook, and she was going to help create a Christmas celebration that would bring joy to dozens of people. She had no way of knowing that her first real cooking lesson would end with the fire department responding to a 3-alarm smoke signal, and that the resulting ban from the kitchen would ultimately lead to the most important discovery of her life.
Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that makes Denver feel like a snow globe waiting to be shaken. Coleen woke up earlier than usual, her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and dread that felt remarkably similar to the morning of her college graduation, full of possibility and terrifying potential for failure. Patricia had already been up for an hour, organizing ingredients on the kitchen counter with the precision of a military strategist planning an invasion. She'd decided to start Coleen's cooking education with sugar cookies, a relatively foolproof recipe that would teach basic measuring, mixing, and timing skills without involving anything that could catch fire or explode. "Morning, mija," Patricia called cheerfully as Coleen shuffled into the kitchen, still wearing her pajamas and fuzzy slippers. "Ready for your first cooking lesson?" Coleen surveyed the array of ingredients spread across the counter. Flour, butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla extract, baking powder. Such innocent-looking items, yet she'd somehow managed to turn similar collections into culinary disasters in the past.
As ready as someone can be when they're about to attempt something they've failed at spectacularly for 15 years, Coleen replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the pot Patricia had prepared. What's the battle plan? First rule of cooking, Patricia announced, pulling an apron from a drawer, is proper preparation. We're going to measure everything first, get all our tools ready, and then proceed step by step. No rushing, no improvising, no thinking you know better than the recipe. This last comment was delivered with a knowing look. Patricia had clearly done her research on Coleen's previous cooking disasters, probably through detailed conversations with other family members who'd witnessed the carnage over the years. I don't improvise, Coleen protested, tying the apron around her waist. I follow recipes exactly. Mija, your cousin Rebecca told me about the time you decided that 1 teaspoon of salt was probably a typo and it should be 1 tablespoon of salt, because what difference could it make? Coleen winced at the memory. The resulting cornbread had been so aggressively salty that the dog had refused to eat the scraps. Okay, point taken. No editorial decisions on my part. Exactly. Today, we're going to prove that you can follow a recipe without any creative interpretations. Miguel wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee and the unusual sight of his wife conducting what appeared to be a formal cooking tutorial at 8 in the morning. Good luck, Coleen, he said, with genuine warmth, kissing Patricia on the cheek. If anyone can teach you to cook, it's this woman. She once taught Carlos to make perfect pancakes, and that kid couldn't figure out how to make cereal without creating a disaster area. I can hear you, came Carlos's voice from somewhere upstairs, followed by Diego's laughter. That's the point, Miguel called back, winking at Coleen. I'm taking the boys to their soccer practice, and then we're going to stay far away until we smell cookies instead of smoke alarms. As the house settled into quiet, Patricia turned to Coleen with the focused intensity of a seasoned teacher about to impart crucial knowledge. Lesson 1. Mise en place. It's French for everything in its place. Professional chefs swear by it, and it's going to save us from chaos. For the next 30 minutes, Patricia guided Coleen through the process of measuring each ingredient precisely, using proper measuring techniques that Coleen had never learned. She discovered that there was a difference between dry measuring cups and liquid measuring cups, that flour should be spooned into the cup and leveled rather than scooped directly from the bag, and that butter temperature could make or break a recipe. I had no idea there was so much science involved, Coleen admitted, carefully measuring vanilla extract with a proper measuring spoon instead of just eyeballing it. I always thought cooking was more intuitive. Baking is science. Cooking can be more intuitive once you understand the basics, but baking is chemistry. Every ingredient has a specific purpose, and changing ratios can completely alter the outcome. This revelation was both enlightening and slightly intimidating. Coleen had always approached recipes like rough suggestions rather than chemical formulas. No wonder her previous attempts had failed so spectacularly. The actual mixing process went surprisingly smoothly. Patricia demonstrated proper creaming technique for the butter and sugar, explaining how the process incorporated air to create light, fluffy cookies. She showed Coleen how to tell when eggs were properly incorporated and how to avoid over-mixing the flour, which could result in tough cookies. You're doing really well, Patricia observed, as Coleen carefully folded the final bit of flour into the dough. See, you have good instincts. You just needed proper instruction. Coleen felt a small surge of pride. The dough looked exactly like cookie dough was supposed to look like. Smooth, slightly sticky, and free of any alarming colors or textures. This was already more successful than 90% of her previous cooking attempts. The rolling and cutting process presented new challenges. Patricia demonstrated how to roll the dough to an even thickness, how to flour the surface to prevent sticking, and how to use cookie cutters efficiently to minimize waste. Coleen's first attempts resulted in oddly shaped cookies with uneven thickness,
but gradually she began to get the hang of it. "Don't worry about making them perfect," Patricia advised, as Coleen struggled to create uniform stars and trees. "Homemade cookies are supposed to look homemade. The important thing is that they're made with love." As they worked side by side, Patricia began sharing stories about Christmas cookies from previous years. There was the year Carlos had insisted on decorating cookies with glitter, not realizing it wasn't edible glitter. The Christmas when Diego had tried to help by adding his own improvements to the frosting, resulting in cookies that tasted like toothpaste. The legendary Christmas Eve when Miguel's mother had visited and declared Patricia's cookies almost as good as store-bought. That was the highest praise she'd ever given anyone's cooking, Patricia laughed. Miguel was so proud he called his brother in Texas to tell him about it.
These stories helped Coleen relax into the process. The kitchen began to feel less like a hostile environment and more like a place where family memories were created, where imperfection was part of the charm rather than a source of anxiety. The cookies went into the oven with minimal drama. Patricia set the timer and taught Coleen the art of oven monitoring, checking for golden edges without opening the door too frequently and disturbing the temperature. "This is the hardest part," Patricia admitted. Waiting, resisting the urge to peek every 30 seconds. While they waited, Patricia pulled out a notebook and began sketching a rough timeline for Christmas preparations. "If you're really committed to helping with Christmas dinner, we need to create a plan. 37 people means we'll need multiple side dishes, desserts, and of course, the main courses." Coleen studied the list, which seemed to contain about 40 different items. "Patricia, this looks like you're planning to feed a small army." "Welcome to Christmas with a Mexican-American family, mija. We don't do anything small. Miguel's family believes that running out of food is the ultimate hostess failure, and my side of the family thinks that having fewer than 5 dessert options is basically insulting the guests." The timer chimed, and they both turned to the oven with anticipation. Patricia opened the door to reveal 24 perfectly golden sugar cookies, each one properly baked and smelling like vanilla and butter and success. "Oh my God," Coleen breathed, staring at the cookies in disbelief. Did we actually make cookies that look like real cookies?" "You made cookies that look like real cookies," Patricia corrected with a proud smile, "and they smell amazing." As they transferred the cookies to cooling racks, Coleen felt something she hadn't experienced in a kitchen before. Genuine pride in her accomplishment. These weren't just edible, they were actually good. She'd followed instructions, paid attention to details, and created something that would bring joy to other people. Miguel and the boys returned home just as Patricia and Coleen were cleaning up, and the aroma of fresh cookies drew them immediately to the kitchen. "No way," Carlos said, stopping in the doorway. "Coleen actually made those?" "We made them together," Coleen replied, unable to keep the pride out of her voice. Diego grabbed a cooled cookie and took a careful bite, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to genuine appreciation. "These are actually really good. Like, really good." "Don't sound so shocked," Coleen laughed, but she was glowing from the praise. Miguel sampled a cookie and nodded approvingly. "Patricia, I think you might have a new cooking partner for Christmas." That afternoon, after the boys had devoured half the cookies and Miguel had proclaimed them restaurant quality, Patricia and Coleen sat down with Grandma Eleanor's recipe box to plan their next steps. "We'll do bread next week," Patricia decided, flipping through the handwritten cards. "Your grandmother's dinner rolls are legendary, and they're not too complicated if you understand yeast." Yeast? Coleen felt her confidence waver slightly. That seems like it could go wrong in lots of ways. Everything can go wrong in lots of ways if you don't understand what you're doing, but now you're learning properly. You understand mise en place. You can follow instructions, and most importantly, you're not afraid to ask questions. As the afternoon sunlight slanted through the kitchen windows, Coleen realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in her adult life, she'd successfully completed a cooking project from start to finish. She'd created something with her own hands that brought joy to other people. More than that, she'd experienced the quiet satisfaction of working alongside someone she loved, sharing knowledge and traditions that connected her to her family's history. The recipe box was no longer a collection of mysterious hieroglyphics. It was a treasure trove of possibilities. "Patricia," she said quietly, "thank you for believing I could do this when I didn't believe it myself." "Mija, everyone deserves to know the joy of creating something delicious for the people they love. Your grandmother would be so proud to see you finally learning her recipes." That evening, Coleen called her friend Jessica in California and actually had good news to share for the first time in months. "Wait, you made cookies? Like, actual, edible cookies?" Jessica's voice carried across the phone with amazement. "Coleen, last time you tried to bake something, you set off smoke alarms in 3 apartments." I know, but I had a proper teacher this time. And Jessica, they were actually good. Like, people asked for the recipe." As they talked, Coleen found herself planning her next cooking adventure. Maybe next weekend she'd try the dinner rolls. Maybe she'd even attempt one of Grandma Eleanor's more challenging recipes. For the first time in her life, the kitchen felt like a place of possibility rather than certain disaster. She had no way of knowing that her growing confidence would lead to the catastrophic night that would eventually transform her life in ways she never could have imagined.
The success with the sugar cookies had given Coleen a dangerous taste of confidence. Over the next 2 weeks, she threw herself into cooking lessons with Patricia with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered a hidden talent. They conquered dinner rolls that rose perfectly in the warm kitchen, mastered a basic marinara sauce that didn't taste like metallic disappointment, and even successfully prepared a practice batch of tamale filling that earned Miguel's grudging approval. "Not bad for a gringa," Feed teased, earning a playful swat from Patricia and a proud grin from Coleen. But with each small victory, Coleen began to develop something that had been notably absent from her previous cooking attempts: ambition. She started studying Patricia's techniques with the intensity of a graduate student, taking notes on temperature variations and timing adjustments. She watched cooking shows during her job search breaks, convinced she was finally understanding the mysteries that had eluded her for so long. The turning point came on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-December when Patricia mentioned almost casually that she was worried about managing all the Christmas Eve preparations on her own. "I'm just getting older, mija," she sighed, looking at the extensive menu they'd planned. 20 years ago, I could cook for 50 people without breaking a sweat. Now, 37 feels overwhelming. Coleen saw an opportunity to prove her worth in a way that went beyond simple assistance. "What if I took on some of the bigger dishes? I mean, I've been doing really well with the lessons. Maybe I could handle something more challenging." Patricia paused in her chopping of onions, considering this proposal carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "The pozole," Coleen said, referring to the traditional Mexican stew that was always the centerpiece of their Christmas Eve dinner. "You've mentioned it's your grandmother's recipe, and I've been studying the technique. I think I could handle it." The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of beans on the stove. Pozole wasn't just any dish. It was the Rodriguez family's signature Christmas Eve tradition, a complex stew that required careful timing, precise seasoning, and an intuitive understanding of how flavors developed over hours of slow cooking. It was the dish that people specifically requested, the one that defined Christmas Eve for their extended family. "Coleen," Patricia said gently, it's not like cookies or dinner rolls. It's a dish that takes years to master. My grandmother taught me when I was 12, and I didn't make a really good batch until I was in my 20s. But Coleen had misinterpreted Patricia's gentle guidance over the past few weeks.
She'd begun to believe that cooking was simply a matter of following instructions carefully, and her recent successes had convinced her that she'd overcome whatever mental block had previously held her back. I know it's complicated, but I've been watching you make it every year since I was a kid. I understand the process, and if I'm going to be a real contributor to this family, I need to take on real responsibilities, not just the easy stuff. Patricia studied her niece's face, recognizing the stubborn determination that ran in their family like a genetic trait. She also recognized something else, the particular kind of overconfidence that comes right before a spectacular failure. Maybe we should practice making it together first, she suggested diplomatically. Patricia, you've already spent so much time teaching me. I want to surprise you. I want to show that I can handle something important without supervision. Against her better judgment, Patricia found herself agreeing to let Coleen attempt the pozole independently. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of planning such an elaborate celebration, or maybe it was the hope that Coleen really had developed the skills necessary for such an undertaking. More likely, it was the desire to encourage her niece's newfound confidence, even if it meant risking Christmas dinner. Okay, she said finally, but we'll do a trial run this weekend. If it goes well, you can make the Christmas Eve batch. Coleen's face lit up with excitement and determination. You won't regret this, Patricia. I'm going to make the best pozole this family has ever tasted. That Saturday morning, Patricia deliberately scheduled errands that would keep her out of the house for most of the day, giving Coleen the independence she'd requested. She left detailed instructions, double-checked that all ingredients were available, and reminded Coleen to call if she had any questions. Remember, she said as she gathered her purse and shopping list, pozole is about patience. Don't rush any of the steps, and don't be afraid to taste and adjust as you go. I've got this, Coleen assured her, already pulling ingredients from the refrigerator with the confidence of someone who'd successfully made cookies and dinner rolls. The first few hours went remarkably well. Coleen followed the recipe meticulously, browning the pork shoulder to perfect golden brown perfection, sautéing onions and garlic until fragrant, and adding spices with the careful precision Patricia had taught her. The kitchen filled with promising aromas that made her mouth water, and her confidence soar.
But pozole, as Patricia had tried to warn her, was a dish that revealed its complexities over time. As the hours passed and the stew simmered, Coleen began to encounter variables that hadn't appeared in any of her previous cooking experiences. The pork was taking longer to become tender than the recipe indicated. The hominy wasn't softening at the expected rate. Most troubling of all, the flavor profile seemed flat and one-dimensional despite her careful following of the recipe. Coleen tasted the stew and frowned. It was edible, but it lacked the depth and richness she remembered from Patricia's versions. She consulted the recipe again, wondering if she'd missed something crucial. This was when her old habits began to resurface. Instead of calling Patricia for guidance, Coleen decided to apply some creative problem-solving. She reasoned that if the flavor was too mild, she simply needed to add more spices. If the pork wasn't tender enough, she could increase the heat to speed up the process. She began making adjustments. A little more cumin here, extra chili powder there, turning up the heat to what seemed like a more efficient cooking temperature. Each modification seemed logical in isolation, but collectively they began to push the dish toward disaster. Miguel and the boys returned from their afternoon basketball game to find the kitchen filled with an aggressive, almost acrid smell that was definitely not the warm, comforting aroma typically associated with pozole. Coleen? Carlos called tentatively from the doorway. What's that smell? It's fine, Coleen called back, frantically stirring the pot and trying to figure out why the bottom seemed to be sticking. Just some final seasoning adjustments. Diego peeked over her shoulder at the pot and made a face. It looks angry. The pozole had indeed taken on an alarming appearance. Instead of the rich, red-brown color of properly prepared stew, it had turned an unappetizing grayish-brown. The surface was bubbling aggressively, and there was definitely something burning on the bottom of the pot. "Maybe we should call Mom," Carlos suggested diplomatically. "No," Coleen said quickly. "I can fix this. I just need to adjust a few things." This was when her old habits began to resurface. Instead of calling Patricia for guidance, Coleen decided to apply some creative problem-solving. She reasoned that if the flavor was too mild, she simply needed to add more spices. If the pork wasn't tender enough, she could increase the heat to speed up the process. She began making adjustments, a little more cumin here, extra chili powder there, turning up the heat to what seemed like a more efficient cooking temperature. Each modification seemed logical in isolation, but collectively they began to push the dish toward disaster. Miguel and the boys returned from their afternoon basketball game to find the kitchen filled with an aggressive, almost acrid smell that was definitely not the warm, comforting aroma typically associated with Pozzoli. Coleen?" Carlos called tentatively from the doorway. "What's that smell?" "It's fine," Coleen called back, frantically stirring the pot and trying to figure out why the bottom seemed to be sticking. "Just some final seasoning adjustments." Diego peeked over her shoulder at the pot and made a face. "It looks angry." The Pozzoli had indeed taken on an alarming appearance. Instead of the rich, red-brown color of properly prepared stew, it had turned an unappetizing grayish-brown. The surface was bubbling aggressively, and there was definitely something burning on the bottom of the pot. "Maybe we should call Mom," Carla suggested diplomatically. "No," Coleen said quickly. "I can fix this. I just need to adjust a few things." This was when years of cooking disasters should have taught her to step back and ask for help. Instead, driven by pride and the desperate desire to prove herself capable, Coleen doubled down on her modifications. She added more liquid, hoping to salvage what was sticking to the bottom. She threw in additional seasonings, trying to mask the increasingly burnt flavor. She adjusted the heat repeatedly, creating temperature fluctuations that further compromised the dish's integrity. Meanwhile, Carlos had quietly texted his mother, "Emergency. Coleen's Pozzoli situation getting scary. Kitchen smells like burning disappointment." Patricia responded immediately, "On my way. Tried to keep her from making it worse." But by the time Patricia rushed through the front door 20 minutes later, the damage was extensive. The kitchen looked like a war zone, with dirty bowls covering every surface, ingredients scattered across the counters, and a pot containing what could generously be described as experimental stew bubbling ominously on the stove. "Mija, what happened?" Patricia asked, surveying the chaos with barely concealed horror. Coleen stood in the middle of the destruction, her apron stained with various sauces, her hair disheveled, and her face showing the particular combination of stubbornness and desperation that comes from refusing to admit defeat even when facing obvious disaster. "I can still save it," she insisted, even though the Pozzoli now resembled something that might be served in a cafeteria in a dystopian novel. "I just need to balance the flavors. Maybe add some sugar to counteract the salt, and some acid to brighten everything up." Patricia gently but firmly moved Coleen away from the stove and turned off the heat. She lifted the lid and immediately understood that this batch of Pozzoli was beyond salvation. The smell alone was enough to make her eyes water, and the appearance suggested that several different cooking disasters had somehow combined into one supremely failed dish. "Coleen, honey, sometimes the best thing you can do is recognize when something isn't working and start over." "But I followed the recipe exactly. Well, mostly exactly. I just made some small adjustments when things weren't going according to plan." "And that's exactly the problem," Patricia said gently. "Pozzoli isn't a dish you can improvise with until you really understand how all the components work together. It's like It's like trying to conduct a symphony when you're still learning to read music. The disappointment on Coleen's face was heartbreaking. All her recent confidence crumbled as she stared at the ruined stew that should have been her triumphant contribution to Christmas dinner. "I really thought I could do it," she whispered. "I thought I'd finally figured out cooking." "You have learned a lot, Mija, but there's a difference between mastering basic techniques and being ready for advanced dishes. It's not a failure. It's like a learning experience." As they began the process of cleaning up the kitchen disaster, Coleen couldn't shake the feeling that she'd somehow proven everyone's worst assumptions about her cooking abilities. All the progress she had made over the past few weeks felt suddenly fragile and questionable. What she didn't realize was that this Pozzoli disaster was just the warm-up act for the spectacular failure that awaited her on Christmas Eve. A failure so complete and dramatic that it would change the trajectory of her entire life. The Pozzoli disaster had shaken Coleen's confidence, but it hadn't broken her determination. In the days following what the family had begun diplomatically referring to as the Pozzoli incident, she threw herself back into simpler cooking tasks with the grim resolve of someone trying to prove that one failure didn't define her entire culinary potential. Patricia, recognizing her niece's fragile state, had wisely scaled back their Christmas preparations to focus on dishes that played to Coleen's demonstrated strengths. They practiced batches of dinner rolls, perfected cookie decorating techniques, and prepared simple side dishes that required more patience than expertise. "Remember, Mija," Patricia kept saying, "Christmas dinner isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about bringing the family together around food made with love." But Coleen wasn't listening to the wisdom in those words. Instead, she was nursing a growing obsession with redemption. The Pozzoli failure had awakened something stubborn and prideful in her character, the same trait that had made her refuse Patricia's help for months when she was struggling financially. She became convinced that her cooking education was incomplete until she could successfully prepare something truly challenging for Christmas Eve. The family's Christmas Eve tradition was legendary in their circle. Extended relatives drove from as far as Santa Fe and Albuquerque to attend Patricia's annual feast. Neighbors who had become honorary family members cleared their schedules months in advance. It was the kind of gathering that people talked about all year, where recipes were guarded like state secrets, and where culinary reputation could be made or destroyed in a single evening. This year's guest list had grown to 42 people, including Miguel's elderly father, who was making his first Christmas visit since his wife's passing 3 years ago, Patricia's sister Carmen, who was flying in from Phoenix with her notoriously picky teenage daughters, and the Hendersons from next door, who had been included in the celebration ever since their own adult children moved to the East Coast. The pressure was immense, and Patricia had been managing her anxiety by creating increasingly detailed preparation schedules and backup plans for every possible cooking catastrophe. What she hadn't planned for was her well-meaning but overconfident niece deciding to stage a secret culinary coup on the most important cooking day of the year. December 24th dawned cold and clear, with a kind of bright winter sunlight that made the snow-covered mountains visible from the Rodriguez kitchen window look like a postcard. Patricia was up before dawn, beginning the complex choreography of preparing a feast for 42 people in a single day. She'd been planning the timeline for weeks, accounting for oven space, stovetop availability, and the precise coordination required to have everything ready simultaneously. Coleen had volunteered to handle support tasks, chopping vegetables, setting tables, managing dishes, and staying completely away from any recipe that could potentially endanger the evening's success. But as she watched Patricia moving through the kitchen with the fluid expertise of someone who'd orchestrated the same celebration for 2 decades, Coleen felt increasingly like a spectator rather than a participant in her own family's traditions. The breaking point came around 3 in the afternoon.
Patricia was simultaneously monitoring the turkey, stirring 3 different sauces, and directing Miguel and the boys in table setup, when her sister Carmen called with a last-minute crisis. "Patricia, I am so sorry, but Elena came down with food poisoning last night and I can't leave her. We're not going to make it for Christmas Eve." Carmen's daughters, Elena and Sofia, were Patricia's favorite nieces after Coleen, and their absence would leave a noticeable gap in the family gathering. Moreover, Carmen had been assigned to bring her famous flan, a dessert that required hours of preparation and couldn't be easily replaced at the last minute. "Don't worry about the flan," Patricia told her sister, though Coleen could see the stress lines deepening around her aunt's eyes. "We'll figure something out. Just take care of Elena." After hanging up, Patricia stood in the middle of her kitchen kingdom, looking suddenly overwhelmed. 42 people were coming for dinner in 4 hours, and she'd just lost both help and a crucial dessert component. "I can make the flan," Coleen offered immediately. Patricia didn't even pause in her stirring. "Mija, flan is incredibly complicated. The caramel alone requires perfect timing, and if you overheat the custard, you taught me the basics of custard when we made bread pudding last week, and I've been watching Carmen make flan every Christmas for 15 years. I know the technique." Watching and doing are completely different things, especially with flan. One mistake and the whole thing curdles or the caramel burns or... "Patricia, you're overwhelmed. You have 42 people coming and you're trying to manage everything yourself. Let me help with something that actually matters." The kitchen was reaching a crescendo of activity. The turkey timer was beeping, the pozole, Patricia's successful version, needed stirring, and guests would begin arriving in less than 4 hours. Patricia looked at her niece's determined face and made a decision she would regret for years to come. "Okay," she said finally, "but you follow the recipe exactly. No improvisation, no adjustments, no creative interpretations. Exactly as written." "I promise," Coleen said, already pulling ingredients from the refrigerator with the confidence of someone who had no idea what she was about to unleash. Patricia set Coleen up at the far end of the kitchen with Carmen's handwritten flan recipe, all necessary ingredients, and strict instructions to ask for help if anything seemed unclear. Then she returned to her own complex choreography of Christmas Eve preparations, trusting that her weeks of patient instruction had prepared her niece for this moment.
For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. Coleen carefully heated milk and cream, whisked eggs with the precision Patricia had taught her, and began the delicate process of making caramel. The amber liquid bubbled appealingly in the saucepan, turning exactly the rich golden color Carmen's recipe specified. But flan, as Patricia could have warned her if she hadn't been simultaneously managing 17 other dishes, is a dessert that punishes overconfidence and rewards years of experience. The caramel stage, in particular, requires an intuitive understanding of sugar chemistry that can't be learned from watching other people cook. The first sign of trouble came when Coleen's caramel began to darken more rapidly than expected. Instead of the gentle progression from gold to amber that she'd observed in previous years, the sugar seemed to accelerate toward a deep brown that bordered on concerning. Carmen's recipe called for deep amber caramel, but didn't specify exactly how deep, and Coleen found herself making split-second decisions about color and consistency that she wasn't qualified to make. Rather than ask Patricia for guidance, her aunt was in the middle of a complex sauce preparation that couldn't be interrupted, Coleen decided to trust her instincts and pulled the caramel off the heat when it looked close enough. The custard preparation went more smoothly, and Coleen felt her confidence returning as she carefully combined the egg mixture with the heated milk. The texture looked perfect, the consistency seemed right, and she was proud of her restraint in not over-whisking the mixture. But when she poured the custard over the caramel in the baking dishes, something was clearly wrong. Instead of the smooth, elegant layering she'd observed in Carmen's preparations, the custard seemed to be reacting strangely with the caramel. The interface between the two layers was bubbling slightly, and there was an odd film forming on the surface. This was the moment when years of cooking disasters should have triggered every alarm bell in Coleen's head. This was when she should have called Patricia over, admitted that something wasn't right, and asked for help before the situation escalated. Instead, driven by the same pride that had led to the Pozzoli disaster, Coleen convinced herself that the appearance was normal and that everything would smooth out during the baking process. She slid the flan dishes into the oven, set the timer according to Carmen's recipe, and returned to her assigned support tasks while silently praying that Christmas dessert wouldn't be another spectacular failure. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. Guests began arriving at 5:30, filling the house with laughter, conversation, and the kind of warm chaos that defines successful family gatherings. Patricia's stress levels decreased as dish after dish emerged from the kitchen, perfectly prepared and beautifully presented. The turkey was golden and juicy, the pozole was rich and flavorful, the tamales were tender and perfectly seasoned. Side dishes appeared in clockwork precision, each one earning compliments from relatives who'd driven hours specifically to taste Patricia's legendary cooking. Coleen basked in the reflected glory of the evening's success, feeling finally like a true contributor to the family's Christmas tradition. She helped serve dishes, refilled drinks, and accepted praise for her role in creating the feast, conveniently managing not to think about the flan still baking in the oven. The timer went off just as the family was finishing the main course, and Coleen excused herself to check on the dessert that would either redeem her culinary reputation or destroy it completely. What she found in the oven was not flan. What she found was a disaster so complete, so spectacularly wrong that it defied easy description. The caramel had somehow separated and crystallized into hard, burnt chunks that had fused to the bottom of the baking dishes. The custard had curdled into something that resembled scrambled eggs suspended in sweet milk. The surface was covered with a skin that looked like it belonged in a medical textbook rather than on a dessert table. But the worst part, the part that would haunt Coleen for months afterward, was the smell. Something in her preparation had gone so fundamentally wrong that the flan was producing an odor that could only be described as aggressively unpleasant. It wasn't just burnt. It was something more complex and disturbing, like sweetness that had gone malevolent. As she stood staring at the ruined dessert, she heard Patricia's voice from the dining room. "Coleen, how's that flan coming? People are asking about dessert." 42 family members and friends were sitting in the next room, expecting the evening to culminate with Carmen's famous flan. Instead, they were about to discover that Coleen White had managed to turn a cherished family recipe into something that would require professional cleaning equipment to remove from the baking dishes. This was the moment when everything she had worked for over the past month, the growing confidence, the sense of belonging in the family kitchen, the hope that she could finally contribute meaningfully to family traditions, was about to collapse in the most public and humiliating way possible.
Standing in the kitchen at 8:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, staring at what could only be described as a flan-shaped abomination, Coleen felt the full weight of her culinary inadequacy crash down upon her. The acrid smell rising from the ruined dessert seemed to mock every lesson Patricia had patiently taught her, every small success she'd celebrated over the past month. "Coleen?" Patricia's voice called again from the dining room, tinged with the first note of concern. "Everything okay in there?" The reasonable response would have been to confess immediately, to admit that the flan was unsalvageable and apologize for overreaching once again. But something in Coleen snapped at that moment, not toward acceptance, but toward a desperate, irrational determination to somehow salvage the evening. She grabbed the ruined flan dishes and shoved them into the back pantry, closing the door on the evidence of her failure. Then she began frantically searching through Patricia's dessert supplies, looking for some way to create a miraculous last-minute substitution that would save face in front of 42 guests. "Just a few more minutes," she called back, her voice pitched higher than normal with barely controlled panic.
This was when Coleen's fundamental misunderstanding of cooking revealed itself most clearly. She'd spent weeks learning individual techniques and recipes, but she'd never grasped the deeper principle that cooking is about understanding ingredients, not just following instructions. In her desperation, she began combining random dessert components in ways that defied both logic and basic food safety. She found a container of store-bought vanilla pudding and decided to transform it into something that might pass for flan. She added caramel sauce from a jar, reasoning that the combination would approximate the flavors guests expected. Then, convinced the mixture needed more sophistication, she began incorporating elements from other desserts Patricia had prepared for previous celebrations. A splash of rum from the tiramisu supplies, some cream cheese from the cheesecake ingredients. Gelatin powder she found in the baking cabinet, added without any understanding of proper dissolution techniques. Each addition seemed logical in her panicked state, but collectively, they were creating something that had never existed in the history of culinary arts. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the extended Rodriguez family was settling into the comfortable rhythm of post-dinner conversation. Miguel's father was sharing stories about Christmas celebrations from his childhood in Guadalajara. The Henderson neighbors were marveling at Patricia's cooking skills. The twins were entertaining their younger cousins with increasingly elaborate stories about their family's legendary holiday traditions. Patricia was basking in the success of another flawless Christmas Eve dinner, accepting compliments with the gracious modesty of someone who'd worked for 20 years to perfect her craft. But as the minutes ticked by without any sign of dessert, she began to worry about what was taking Coleen so long in the kitchen. "Maybe I should check on her," she murmured to Miguel, who was deep in conversation with his brother about upcoming soccer season predictions. "Give her a few more minutes," Miguel advised. "She's probably just nervous about presentation. You know how she gets about wanting everything to be perfect." If only they had known that at that very moment, Coleen was attempting to use a blowtorch, Patricia's professional-grade kitchen torch meant for caramelizing sugar, to somehow fix the surface of her improvised dessert mixture. She'd never used a culinary torch before, but she'd seen it done on cooking shows and reasoned that applying heat might somehow transform her chaotic pudding combination into something that resembled actual flan. The torch, designed for precise caramelization of sugar, was not meant to be waved frantically over a bowl of mixed pudding, cream cheese, and gelatin. What happened next was a cascade of disasters that would later require professional cleaning services to fully address. The improvised dessert mixture, already unstable due to incompatible ingredients, began to separate and bubble under the intense heat. The rum she'd added created small flares that singed her eyebrows and sent her stumbling backward into the center island. Her stumble knocked over a container of flour that exploded across the kitchen in a white cloud that coated every surface within a 6-foot radius.
This was the moment when Coleen's evening went from merely embarrassing to genuinely dangerous. Instead of immediately calling for help, her panic-induced adrenaline led her to attempt firefighting techniques she'd seen in movies but had never actually practiced. She grabbed a nearby dish towel to beat at the flames, not realizing that the towel was slightly damp and would only spread the burning flour rather than extinguish it. The kitchen was rapidly filling with smoke from burning flour, the acrid smell of her ruined flan experiments, and now the distinct odor of singed fabric as her dish towel caught fire. The smoke detectors, which had remained mercifully silent during previous minor cooking mishaps, finally decided this situation warranted their full attention. The piercing shriek of multiple smoke alarms cut through the dining room conversation like a fire siren, sending 42 guests into various states of alarm and confusion. Patricia dropped her coffee cup and ran toward the kitchen, followed by Miguel and several other family members who'd had enough experience with kitchen emergencies to know that smoke alarms plus Coleen usually equaled serious trouble. What they found when they burst through the kitchen door was a scene that would become family legend for generations to come.
Coleen stood in the center of a kitchen that looked like it had been bombed by a flour truck, holding a smoldering dish towel with singed eyebrows and a wild expression that suggested she'd been through combat. Small fires were still burning along the counter, smoke was pouring from both the ruined flan in the pantry and whatever was left of her improvised replacement dessert, and every surface in the room was coated with a fine layer of flour that made the whole scene look like a bizarre winter wonderland. "Jesus Christ, Coleen!" Miguel shouted, grabbing a proper fire extinguisher from the utility closet and quickly dousing the remaining flames. "What the hell happened in here?" The smoke detectors were still shrieking, the guests in the dining room were murmuring with concern and curiosity, and Patricia was staring at the destruction of her perfect kitchen with an expression that cycled rapidly through shock, horror, and something that might have been the beginning of hysteria. "I was just trying to fix the flan," Coleen said weakly, as if this explanation could somehow make the chaos surrounding them seem reasonable. Within minutes, the house was swarming with emergency responders. A neighbor had called 911 upon seeing smoke pouring from the Rodriguez house, and 3 fire trucks, an ambulance, and 2 police cars had arrived with full lights and sirens blazing. The entire Christmas Eve celebration ground to a halt as firefighters swept through the house, checking for structural damage and ensuring that the fire was completely extinguished. The fire chief, a patient man named Captain Rodriguez, no relation, who'd apparently seen this kind of holiday cooking disaster before, surveyed the kitchen with professional detachment. "Well," he announced to the assembled family, "the good news is that there's no structural damage and everyone's safe. The bad news is that this kitchen is going to need professional cleaning before it's safe to use again. That flour got into everything, the ventilation system, the appliances, even the light fixtures." As the reality of what had happened began to sink in, Coleen found herself the center of attention in the worst possible way. 42 guests, 3 fire trucks worth of emergency responders, and her extended family were all staring at her as the person responsible for turning Christmas Eve into a scene from a disaster movie. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the chaos of cleanup and investigation. Patricia, meanwhile, was dealing with the practical implications of having her kitchen declared temporarily unusable on the biggest cooking day of the year. The evening celebration, which had been proceeding flawlessly until dessert time, was effectively over. Guests began making awkward excuses to leave early, emergency responders were tracking flour through the house, and the smell of burnt flan was seeping into everything. But the worst part, the moment that would haunt Coleen for months afterward, came when Patricia finally turned to her with an expression of exhausted disappointment. "Coleen, I think it would be better if you stayed out of my kitchen from now on. At least until we can figure out what went wrong here." The ban was delivered gently, almost apologetically, but it landed on Coleen like a physical blow. After a month of cooking lessons, small successes, and growing confidence, she was back to being the family member who couldn't be trusted around anything more complicated than a microwave. As the emergency responders finished their work and the last guests departed, Coleen retreated to her room and called her friend Jessica in California. "I need to get out of here," she said without preamble when Jessica answered the phone. "I just turned my family's Christmas into a 3-alarm fire and got banned from the kitchen forever. I'm a complete disaster as a human being." What Coleen didn't realize as she packed her belongings that night with tears streaming down her face was that this spectacular failure was about to lead her toward the most important discovery of her life. Sometimes the biggest disasters open doors that would never have been accessible through success alone. 3 months after the Christmas Eve disaster that would forever be known in Rodriguez family lore as the Great Flan Fire of 2024, Coleen sat in a bustling coffee shop in downtown Denver, staring at her laptop screen in disbelief. The email she'd just received was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything she'd believed about her life's trajectory, that she had to read it 3 times before the words began to make sense. "Dear Ms. White," it began. "We were fascinated by your application and particularly intrigued by your unique background in catastrophic cooking failures, as mentioned in your cover letter. We would like to offer you a position as safety content developer for our new cooking education platform. The job offer had come from an unexpected source entirely. After leaving the Rodriguez house in shame on Christmas night, Coleen had spent January in a cramped sublet apartment, surviving on convenience store meals and the crushing weight of her own humiliation. She'd avoided family gatherings, dodged Patricia's concerned phone calls, and tried to pretend that her month of cooking lessons had never happened. But somewhere in the depths of her post-disaster depression, something strange had begun to emerge. Instead of avoiding all thoughts of cooking, Coleen found herself obsessively analyzing what had gone wrong. Not just with the flan, but with every cooking disaster she'd ever created. She began documenting her failures with the methodical precision of a scientist studying a particularly fascinating form of entropy. What started as therapeutic self-flagellation gradually evolved into something more systematic. Coleen realized that her cooking disasters weren't random accidents. They followed predictable patterns of overconfidence, inadequate preparation, and fundamental misunderstanding of basic principles. More importantly, each disaster contained lessons that could potentially prevent other people from making the same mistakes. In February, driven by boredom and a perverse kind of pride in her comprehensive failure record, she'd started a blog called Kitchen Catastrophes, a masterclass in what not to do. She wrote detailed postmortems of her cooking disasters, complete with photographs of the carnage and step-by-step analysis of where everything had gone wrong. The blog post about the Christmas Eve flan fire had gone viral within a week. Apparently, thousands of people around the world had experienced similar cooking disasters and were desperate for someone who could validate their experiences while providing practical guidance on how to avoid repeating them. Food safety experts began sharing her posts. Cooking instructors used her disaster analyses as teaching tools. Professional chefs started commenting with technical explanations of why her mistakes had led to such spectacular failures. Within 2 months, Kitchen Catastrophes had attracted a following of over 50,000 readers who were hungry for content that acknowledged the reality of cooking failure without the shame typically associated with culinary incompetence. The job offer had come from Coleen White, a startup developing online cooking education programs for beginners. They had been struggling to create content that addressed the psychological barriers that prevented people from learning to cook. The fear of failure, the shame of not knowing basic techniques, the intimidation factor of traditional cooking instruction. Your approach to teaching through failure analysis is exactly what we've been looking for, Sarah Chen, the hiring manager, had explained during their phone interview. Most cooking education assumes that people learn best through success, but our research shows that many adult learners actually benefit more from understanding what can go wrong and why. The position would involve developing safety protocols, creating troubleshooting guides, and producing educational content that helped cooking novices avoid common disasters. It was a job that required Coleen's unique combination of environmental science background, systematic thinking, and comprehensive experience with culinary failure. More importantly, it was work that gave meaning to every embarrassing cooking disaster she'd ever created. Her burned scrambled eggs, her concrete cookies, her infamous salmonella chicken incident, the Pozzoli catastrophe, and yes, even the Great Flan Fire. All of it suddenly had purpose beyond mere humiliation. The funny thing is, Coleen told Jessica during their weekly video call, I'm finally using my degree in a way that actually helps people, just not in the way I ever imagined. So you're basically getting paid to be professionally bad at cooking? Jessica asked, grinning. I'm getting paid to help other people avoid being bad at cooking the same ways I was bad at cooking. It's like disaster prevention through comprehensive failure documentation. The work was more fulfilling than anything Coleen had ever imagined. She spent her days researching food safety protocols, interviewing professional chefs about common beginner mistakes, and developing educational materials that addressed the emotional aspects of cooking failure. Her blog had evolved into a comprehensive resource that combined practical instruction with the kind of honest acknowledgement of difficulty that most cooking education ignored. But perhaps the most unexpected development was what had happened with her family relationships. Patricia,
after the initial shock and disappointment of Christmas Eve, had begun following Coleen's blog with fascination.
Mija, she'd said during their first real conversation since the kitchen ban, I never realized how many people struggle with cooking the same way you did. Your writing, it's helping people feel less alone with their kitchen disasters. The kitchen ban, which had felt like exile at the time, had forced Coleen to develop a completely different relationship with food and cooking. Instead of trying to master techniques she wasn't ready for, she'd become an expert in understanding the science behind why things went wrong. She could now explain the chemistry of why her flan had failed, the physics of why her flour explosion had been so dramatic, and the psychology of why panic had led her to make such catastrophically poor decisions. It's ironic, she told her new boss, Sarah, during one of their weekly check-ins. Getting banned from the kitchen was the best thing that ever happened to my understanding of cooking. When I was trying to actually cook, I was too focused on success to really understand the process. Now that I'm analyzing failures, I finally understand how cooking actually works. Culinary Wise had been so impressed with Coleen's work that they'd promoted her to head of safety education within 6 months. Her Kitchen Catastrophe series had become one of their most popular educational offerings, and cooking schools around the country were beginning to incorporate her failure analysis methodology into their curricula. The breakthrough moment came when the Food Network reached out about featuring her work in a documentary about cooking education. The producer, a woman named Maria Santos, had found Coleen's blog while researching a segment about common cooking mistakes. What you've created is revolutionary, Maria explained during their initial meeting. You've figured out how to teach cooking by examining failure instead of just demonstrating success. It's like learning to drive by understanding what causes accidents instead of just watching good drivers. The documentary, tentatively titled The Science of Kitchen Disasters, would feature Coleen working with amateur cooks to analyze their cooking failures and develop strategies for improvement. It was an opportunity to reach millions of people who, like her, had been intimidated away from cooking by early disasters and the shame that typically accompanied them. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Miguel's father, Don Roberto, had reached out through Patricia to request a copy of Coleen's blog post translated into Spanish. At 83, he'd decided he wanted to learn to cook for himself after decades of relying on others to prepare his meals. Your granddaughter, she understands something important about cooking that most teachers don't. She knows that making mistakes isn't shameful. It's educational. I've been afraid to try cooking because I didn't want to look foolish, but reading about her disasters, it makes me feel like maybe it's okay to be bad at something while you're learning it. On a warm Saturday morning in June, almost exactly a year after she'd moved in with the Rodriguez family as a struggling, unemployed graduate, Coleen returned to Patricia's kitchen for the first time since Christmas Eve. The kitchen had been professionally cleaned and renovated after the fire damage, and it gleamed with new appliances and fresh paint. I'm not here to cook, Coleen announced as she set up her laptop and camera equipment on the counter. I'm here to document Patricia's techniques for the Culinary Wise Advanced series. But as she filmed Patricia preparing her legendary tamales, something had shifted in their dynamic. Instead of the teacher-student relationship they had before, they now worked as collaborators. Coleen's understanding of food science complemented Patricia's intuitive expertise, and together they created educational content that was both technically accurate and emotionally supportive. You know what I've learned? Coleen said as they finished filming. I was never actually bad at cooking. I was just learning in the wrong way, trying to master techniques before I understood principles. And, more importantly, I was so afraid of failure that I couldn't learn from my mistakes. Patricia smiled, watching her niece pack up equipment that represented a career built on embracing rather than avoiding failure. Your granddaughter would be so proud, mija. Not because you learned to cook, but because you learned to turn your struggles into something that helps other people. As Coleen drove back to her new apartment, a spacious place in Capitol Hill that she could now afford thanks to her success with Culinary Wise, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from kitchen disaster to professional expertise. The Christmas Eve fire that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of a career she could have never imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Saw the Food Network announcement. From burned scrambled eggs to national television, that's got to be some kind of record. Coleen laughed, remembering the girl who'd been too embarrassed to bring homemade food to potlucks. Now she was helping thousands of people overcome their own cooking fears and building a career on the foundation of her most spectacular failures. Sometimes the best way forward isn't through avoiding disasters, but through learning to transform them into wisdom. And sometimes being banned from the kitchen is exactly what you need to finally understand what cooking is really about. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.